Once when L.J. come home on furlough from the Army, he went down to a radio shack and bought him what he called a CB radio. And he bought him a great big aerial that had big long prongs what stuck out every which way, and he put it up high on a pole. And when he tied this wire from this aerial down to that CB radio of his'n, he could talk back and forth to the fellers on the radio station. He said that CBs was catching on with truck drivers and just about everybody, and that we are to learn how to use it. Well, after L.J. had gone back to the service for a spell, we got to wondering about how the war was going, and we wondered where L.J. might be fighting at and all like that, so we decided that we maybe ought to turn on that CB radio and see if we could hear some news on it. Well, L.J.'s mama and Granny and Grandpa got their chairs and scooted up real close to that CB radio so they could hear real good, you know, and then I turned that thing on. I turned it to every station on that CB radio, and there weren't no news on nary station. There weren't even no good country music on it. And Grandpa said he'd watched L.J. play that CB radio, and for me to push that button on that microphone and tell one of them fellers to give me the news, and maybe he would. Well, I turned it to station number 7, and this feller was saying, breaker 7, breaker 7. Anybody got ears on this fireball? How about it? Well, I pushed that button down, and I said, hey there, you hear me? He said, 10-4, 10-4, the fireball's got you. What's your handle come on? I told him my handle come on the axe. He said, 10-4, 10-4, axe, old buddy. How do you copy fireball? Well, Mama got her pencil and tablet and said it was F-I-R-E-B-A-L-L. So I pushed that button and said, F-I-R-E-B-A-L-L. How's that? He said, 10-4, 10-4, Roger, old buddy. How about your 20? Well, I told him my name weren't Roger, and I didn't have no 20. I told him I ain't even got a 10. I told him what we wanted was some news on this fireball station. He said, well, I'm driving a helicopter, and I'm trying out a new big gun, so I took the old ground plane down. I put some boots on it for some more juice, how about it? Now, Grandpa didn't catch that, and I said it sounded to me like that he said he was driving a helicopter, and he had shot a plane on the ground with this big gun of his, and that he had his boots full of juice. Well, Grandpa said that sounds just like Vietnam, the place L.J.'s been telling me about. Well, I asked him if he'd seen L.J. and if he had, to make sure he didn't drink too much of that juice that he had there in his boots. Then he says, what kind of rig y'all got? Well, I told him the only rig we had was an old buggy. It was down in the barn, and that it had a wheel off of it, and that we hadn't used it none since a mule had died. He wanted to know then if I was base or mobile. Well, I didn't know what he meant by that, so I told him that we was mostly Baptists and Democrats up there on the ridge. He said, I take it by that y'all must be bootlegging a little bit. Now, that made me mad, because it weren't none of his business if we was or not, and I told him to hash up. He'd have every revenue in the state down on us. Then he said, 10-4, 10-4, axe, old buddy. I'm going to pass along all them good numbers to you, and I'm going to clear this old channel. Well, I figured out right there he was in this lottery and numbers racket. And I told him I didn't want him sending me no numbers, and I'd appreciate it if he didn't get L.J. mixed up in it either. Then I turned to this station number 19, and we heard the awfulest story we ever witnessed in our life. There was this Texas bandit a-talking to a jackrabbit of all things. And they said that there was bears crawling all over the place. And there was this man at 103 out taking pictures, and then somebody yelled that a bear got him. And about that time, Granny started yelling and squalling because there wasn't nobody out there to help that poor old man that was out taking pictures. And then Grandpa said it's a sin and a crime to have this much crime on the radio, and we ought to turn it off. So I did. Now, L.J.'s mama was still concerned about L.J. and said, I sure hope he wasn't in that plane that fireball feller shot down with his helicopter. Well, I told her if L.J. had quit running around with that fireball feller and drinking that juice out of his boots, he wouldn't get in such bodacious messes. Now, L.J. had been gone off to college for 2 years or so when he got drafted into the Army. Well, he brung his stuff from college, and he stayed home 2 or 3 days before he left for the service. Now, after he was gone for a while, L.J.'s mama got to probing through all this stuff that he had brung home from college, and she found this little sack of seeds. Now, it didn't say on the sack what kind of seeds they was, so L.J.'s mama was figuring they was flower seeds. Yeah. She took them and showed them to Grandma, and she surmised they could be vegetable seeds even. So they got Grandpa to looking at it. Now, Grandpa says, they do look a little bit like okra seeds to me. Well, it was garden planting time. And Granny and L.J.'s mama had dug up flower beds all over the yard, and Grandpa had plowed up a right smart-sized garden spot. And he planted 3 or 4 rows of these seeds just in case they was okra, you know. It didn't take long till them things started growing and sprouting up all over the place. And it weren't too long till Grandpa figured out it weren't nothing but a dad-burned bunch of weeds. He said we ought to get rid of them. But L.J.'s mama and Granny held on to the very end that they would blossom into some kind of beautiful flower. But the only thing that they growed was weeds and more seeds. Grandpa, he got so aggravated with them, he started cutting them down and saying we ought to get rid of them, like I told you, and cussed every one of them weeds and L.J. for bringing them home. But L.J.'s mama says I'm going to have to gather up all these seeds and save them for L.J. Because when he comes home, maybe he'll tell me what the use for growing weeds in college was for. Well, Granny said there ain't no smart child like L.J. gonna bring home something that ain't good for something. So she said maybe they're like some kind of good greens and we ought to bile up a pot full of them and see what they tasted like. So she got her a big kettle and she biled up a big bunch of these here leaves, and when they'd simmered a while, she took her big spoon and she stirred around in them, and then she tasted it. She smacked her lips and swallowed a couple times, and she said they sure ain't for biling, so she got Grandpa to take the whole pot full of them out and throw them out to the hogs. Now, them hogs went after him tooth and toenail. Well, L.J.'s mama and Granny got to figuring, you know something, they might be some kind of good greens. Or they might, if they ain't good for greens, they might be some kind of good sipping tea. So L.J.'s mama, she got a few leaves of it, you know, and she biled her up a pot full of it. And when it had boiled and they put some cream and sugar in it, her and Granny started sipping it hot. Now, then Granny got this bright idea. She said, you know, if you grind up a few of them old dried up leaves, it looks just like oregano. And I bet you it's a good kind of cooking herb. So she was baking some light bread and she throwed some of it in there even. And she found one of Grandpa's empty, half-gallon size Prince Albert tobacco cans, and she saved her up a whole can full of it up in the cupboard. Now, she hadn't any more and put it up there till Grandpa come in, reached up and got what he thought was a handful of Prince Albert and put it in his pocket. And unbeknownst to what it was, he filled up his pipe with it and started smoking. Well, L.J.'s mom and Granny seen what he had done, and they started sort of snickered and giggled. Fact is, they just busted out laughing. Well, Grandpa, it didn't take him long to figure out it weren't Prince Albert. But when he heard these here women laughing, he figured they had pranked him some way, and he was just going to let them go on and have their fun, and he'd just go on and smoke it like he didn't know the difference. Well, about that time, them pigs started squealing, and they busted out of the pen, and Grandpa started hooping and yelling, and he was trying to chase them back in there. They said you could hear him hooping for about 14 miles. And Granny says, hello, I better get set, because I ain't seen your grandpa that pert in the last 20 years. They said that Grandpa went flying past that front door. He was hot on the heels of one of them big sows, and he was yelling, save them seeds, save them seeds.